everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of State of Play, or as it's known around the office, the Miguel, Delaney, Adam Clery comedy vehicle. Welcome back to the podcast that is freeform and jazz, but talks about the pressing issues? The big issues.
For one, it's freeform and jazz, the wider structures. And
the wider structure around the world of football. Now, I want to start today. I've got a question for you. The question that I suspect has been asked in every single British pub for the last 8 or so days. Now, I have 4 answers in my head that could all apply to this, and I think they're all individually correct in their own right? The question is, how can you have a major European final contested by the 16th and 17th place teams in a league? Go.
So I have been looking at this, and it is statistically the worst European final ever.
Unprecedented, I think, is the nicest way to put it.
Yeah. There's never been a final where both teams are so low on the table, and obviously this has almost a greater element of farce to it, given they were from the same league, and just even the symbolism of the two of them sitting above the relegation zone. There's an argument. It's probably one description is maybe the most desperate game of football ever played. Especially given the way
we're gonna call the video that.
But it's incredible. Like even the way this has been framed almost exclusively in the context of next season and the potential Champions League.
Yep.
And I do think actually that's a little bit of a shame because while Man United have won even this dreadful era, they've won trophies.
Yeah,
for Spurs,
I was there.
For all of this stuff with Spurs, they it would genuinely mean something on a purely emotional level. There'd be classic glory to it. But even with Spurs, you can't escape all this wider stuff. And just to be mildly serious for a moment, and actually there is something very interesting here. So one of the big discussions in all this has been how the Europa League has been changed because Champions League clubs no longer drop into it.
That was number 2 of the 4 answers I had in my head. Yeah, that's good. We'll take that one off.
So there is and that is for a very distinctive reason. So as we know, the Champions League expanded 36 teams. Mm-hmm. Initially, 2 of the places were supposed to be these sort of, you'd almost call them safety net positions, basically. So the two places in the 36 teams are going to be reserved, essentially for clubs with a strong recent history in the Champions League. So the entire intention behind this is basically, so if a Man United have a bad season,
you can just stick them in.
Exactly. Now, to be fair, there were certain figures in UEFA who worked against this, rallied some fan support, and got it changed.
How was that going to... Was it just going to be as vague? Were they just basically going to pick 2 teams they liked, or was there going to be some kind of criteria for it?
It would have been on kind of, I think,
coefficients,
from like the previous decade of performance.
Which is great, because nobody understands coefficients. You could just make it up.
And similarly, one of the rules they used to have before this, of course, was that prize money in the Champions League was allotted based on the same sort of thing, royalties, how long you'd been in the competition. But so they managed to get rid of that. But one of the compromises apparently was, and I've been speaking to people in European football who work in these sort of decisions over the last week about this, and they said one of the compromises was basically that Champions League clubs no longer drop in. And why? Because then if you're one of the, so I suppose you'd call them one of the 15 clubs who would have been considered for a Super League, as well as the 12 who were actually in it, and you have a bad season, you've got the insurance then of, you've essentially got a clear run at the Europa League, at least without kind of the potential complication of Champions League level clubs. So say had this season had the 36 Champions League clubs gone straight through to a knockout round in the playoff, top 16, say, well, that means it's Manchester City in the Europa League, and suddenly the whole dimension of the trophy changes. So
that's even funnier.
Yeah.
In a way.
So it's like essentially that this final in some ways it's just another way that European football has been contorted and changed in this way. And I do have to say, I felt similar about the FA Cup in this sense. It's the shame of it in that sense is we don't even see a final like this in terms of glory anymore. It's in terms of like what it's worth and this increasing financialization of football. Whereas I say, like for Spurs, it would mean it's a massive moment in their history if they win it, and even for Manchester United, for all they've won, it's still like...
I personally really liked... I know we got a bit of flack for this. I really liked Ange Postecoglou's response where he was sort of given the comparison of like, Man United have said winning this finals, what it is, but doesn't fix their season. It doesn't represent success whatsoever. And I presume he saw it where he just turned around and was like, why do I care what Man United think? Like, we're not Man United. Like, it's different to us. They won the FA Cup last season, the Carabao Cup the year before. And this is, somehow them getting 3 consecutive trophy seasons.
Yeah.
When this is comfortably the worst Manchester United, both on and off the pitch, anyone can remember, is just, I hate that. I've got so many friends who support Man United, and if come this time next week, if they are happy, then I am happy. I am happy for them. But my God, as an institution, there's something so deep in my core that needs them to not win this final.
Also, it's interesting. So, one thing I've noticed in United media at the moment, they've done a documentary on the 1991 Cup Winners' Cup run. Which was another kind of launchpad moment.
That's so clever.
Yeah.
That's so
because
clever.
It does feel like they're parallels. And obviously the Cup Winners' Cup run itself came from these kind of like this butterfly moment of Mark Robins scoring against Nottingham Forest in 1990. And there are, if, say, they win, and if Ruben Amorim goes on to recreate a glory era of Manchester United, there are so many butterfly moments throughout it. You go back to Newport County leading 2-0 in the FA Cup, Coventry's late goal disallowed, that cup final, Ten Hag staying on, and then suddenly the Lyon game, the Bilbao.
The thing is, right, I've heard the name Mark Robins so many times since Alex Ferguson left Manchester United. Every season, there's a game or a goal or something happens, and everyone goes, is this David Moyes' Mark Robins moment? Is this Louis van Gaal's Mark Robins moment? The Coventry game's the exact one. That gets ruled out. It's like, do you think this is Eric Ten Hag's Mark Robins moment? And it's never the Mark Robins moment.
Well, it might be for Ten Hag, but it could yet be for Amorim. Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. But on that point about Postecoglou as well, I think there's also something instructive as to how this final will go. And how and why we're here. So
it's two drunks fighting, isn't it?
Well, on that. So very early on in Postecoglou's time, and this is one of the reasons he's almost certainly going to go no matter what.
Time at Spurs.
Yeah, he kind of echoed some of Pochettino's earlier arguments that like ultimately in the grand scheme of things, cups they're nice to win. But they don't mean. This is an exact quote. I'm kind of paraphrasing his.
Yeah, he would have said mate, obviously. So.
Well, of course, mate. But he was talking about how like cups don't necessarily point to sustainable progress, and that's of course why he was brought in to impose an ideology. Sustainable. And what's actually happened in this cup run? Well, he's basically, in purely football tactical sense, I think he's abandoned a lot of his principles. He's almost treated a lot of Europa League games like I'd say Jose Mourinho would.
I think that's a point not a lot of people made because I thought the Frankfurt, both home and away legs, I thought they were excellent, really tactically excellent in those games. But it didn't feel like you were watching Ange Postecoglou.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet, for some reason, he then turns up. Was it Wolves they had last weekend? He turned up at the Premier League, and it's like, okay, so we're capable of like really sort of like grinding these games out a bit and being more controlled in our play. That's some European nonsense, though. This is the Barclays.
And the classic with that was against Bodo Glimt. Bodo Glimt are, let's be, ultimately, for all they've received a lot of praise, what they're doing great things. But ultimately, we're talking about a club many levels below Spurs.
Oh God,
tiny. And what did Spurs do in that game? They didn't really play football as such. They basically used their expensive players up front like Richarlison and bullied the Norwegian team into submission. And actually, it specifically reminded me of the Europa League final in 2017 when Mourinho's United...
the Man United one.
And they basically, if they wanted, or really United should be able to play Ajax, especially a young, callow Ajax like that, off the park. But what do? They physically bullied them exactly the same way. And hence...
Do you think both teams are going to do that in this one?
No, I think there's an interesting question here. A, why does Postecoglou not do... Why isn't he more pragmatic in the league? And B, can it work in the league in the same way? And by extension, can it work in this final in the same way?
Well, actually, you've touched on an interesting point there about Spurs' system being different from competition to competition. The Man United system hasn't been different from competition to competition, but the performances and the quality of the individual players, it literally looks like they're playing with a separate squad. And that's one of the answers that there is for why we're in this situation, is because the quality of the Premier League is so substantially higher than the vast majority of the other, like, relative placements in the league do not equal the same sort of team. So Man United look fantastic playing in the Europa League because the teams they're playing against aren't as good as Wolves. They aren't as good as the mid-table teams in the Premier League in terms of how they apply themselves, how they go after teams, how they do these things. So all of a sudden you're seeing a more sort of carefree, a more expressive, a more technical Manchester United side because they're allowed to be that way. They look like a great team in this competition because comparatively they are. Whereas you measure them up against... both teams, I would say, are completely on merit in that position in the league.
I suppose Bilbao are an interesting example because, Bilbao are what? They're at the moment fourth... At the time of recording, fourth in the Spanish league, and that is obviously
missing huge. Thing is, though, they were missing huge. You take those players out, the quality of that side.
But also another argument I would make, just to feed into your point there, or to agree with your point, The Spanish league obviously has the big two, then Atletico, and then there's basically it's actually quite an interesting league after that because it's so volatile.
Well, look at your own.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, my boy is Osasuna. But Bilbao, like suddenly they've got a good squad. They unfortunately will likely lose some players this summer, and they were able to put this run together. But that's something that can happen from season to season. It doesn't necessarily speak to overall quality. Hence, United were able to do this to a team that's fourth in the Spanish league.
Would you like to hear? I've done a small bit of research here. Would you like to hear what the equivalent Europa League final would be if the similarly placed teams in the other major European leagues had somehow gone on this run? Well, we would have Parma versus Venezia, which feels like a cup final from the 90s. That conceivably could have existed.
Yeah.
Espanyol versus Alaves, which weirdly that sounds like an early noughties UEFA Cup final to me. Like that could happen. Remy versus Nantes, which sounds like a 1950s cup final.
We're stretching that's a Metropa Cup.
That's like a Fairs Cup sort of thing. And then you've got St. Pauli versus Hoffenheim, which sounds like a Europa League final from a football manager save.
But it's actually interesting that as well. So obviously the Champions League is the ultimate, especially since it's gone to 4 teams and it crowns the best in the continent. It speaks to the strength. But obviously the Champions League, we're at a point now where there's 12 super clubs. One of them's going to win it. But I think the Europa League and the old UEFA Cup has always actually almost been more relevant to speak to deeper strength of a league. So exactly at that point, you think about your St. Pauli Hoffenheim game. The German league was probably at its height in the late 70s. It had a lot of all-German finals. Yep. As you say, we had a lot of all-Italian finals in the 90s. And now I think the very fact that Man United and Spurs are here, despite doing so badly, suddenly speaks to this strength of the Premier League. And which I think we've spoken about this in the pod. I don't think it's healthy football as a whole. I like the vitality and variety of European football. But here we are,
It's sort of... It kind of beggars belief that there's no English team in the Champions League final when it's felt like a lock an English team was going to win the Europa League from the semi-final draw pretty much onwards. Chelsea have just basically been going around the dressing room on the Thursday morning asking, does anybody fancy a game tonight, and putting a side out and winning 5-0 in the Conference League.
I have to say, just as a brief tangent, I really, really hate the big teams from the Big Five leagues being in the conference. Now, Fiorentina fans might appreciate that, given they're so desperate to win it. They're desperate. Yeah. We always saw the value at West Ham, but it's not for these clubs. It's basically the whole point was to give clubs from lower leagues a European opportunity.
Well, this is the problem with it, right? If you sort of look, like you said, Spain's got the big two. Italy, despite the relative quality problems they've got at the minute, there's still clubs with stature. You'd say there's 4 or 5 of those. The problem with it being is if you're only going to let 4, sometimes 5 big teams from England go into the Champions League, it means that more often than not, those places in the league underneath them, obviously not this season, Tottenham and Man United have plummeted down, are going to be filled by teams that by rights could easily compete in the Champions League. Yeah. There's a reason why there was a big 6, and now obviously Newcastle and Aston Villa are in there who could hold their own in that competition.
Yeah.
All of a sudden there's 8 or 9 teams who could conceivably be in the Champions League, but would also just bully the lower competitions as well.
How do you think Iriola's Bournemouth would have done in the Champions League this season?
They've got such 1990s classic UEFA Cup. If Bournemouth wasn't in England, if it was a very small provincial town in France, that would be a really romanticised football team. Iriola's Bournemouth. I think they potentially could have won that competition.
Yeah.
In fact, you could make the argument any single team in the Premier League who are above 16th and 17th place could be in that Europa League
Which,
final.
of course, speaks to a wider argument happening now about this gap between the Premier League and EFL as well. Mm-hmm. I think we've got a point where there's essentially 16, 17 teams who are now entrenched in the Premier League. It's going to take something look at West Ham. West Ham had an abysmal season.
Well, look how bad Everton were for for 3 or 4 years. They looked like they were circling the drain. Yeah. One little good run of form, Moyes comes in, they feel a bit revitalised. All of a sudden, they feel absolutely fine. Look at Wolves.
I know. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the turn. Yeah, and again, as you say, Wolves actually have, for all the relative issues this season and the relative quality compared to the Premier League, they've got one of the kind of standout players in Cunha, who now Man United and to a lesser extent Arsenal obviously wants. Would
you like to hear? I've had some time to kill on the tube on the way in. Would you like to hear what the Europa League final would have been in previous seasons had it been contested by the 16th and 17th places? Now, I don't do this as a waste of everybody's time. If you are a Manchester United or Tottenham fan and you're still watching after everything we've said, I think you'll take something from this, because there's actually, I would say, there's glimmers of hope hearing these possible fixtures. So last season would have had Nottingham Forest versus Brentford. 2 sides who upwardly mobile this season. I think if you fast forward 12 months and Manchester United are where Nottingham Forest are and Tottenham are where Brentford are, I think both sets of fans would be happy with that as an improvement. So there's something there. Season before, Nottingham Forest versus Everton, which that's such an 80s fixture. You'd love to watch that, wouldn't you? Everton versus Leeds the season before.
Again, a 1970s fixture.
Another 1970s fixture. Brighton versus Burnley. That's a real sort of...
That's a clash of eras.
That's an Intercities Cup or something like that, isn't it? That's a conference.
Or the old Anglo-Italian Cup.
West Ham Villa the year before that.
That's a bit 1980s.
So I think if you look at those fixtures, it's not no hopers. It's not teams that have plummeted.
There are a lot
division.
of clubs there that have suddenly enjoyed.
With the exception of Burnley,
yeah,
I probably Leeds, although they're coming back up now. With the exception of sort of two of those clubs, everybody's been 16th and 17th place. Clearly, a good launching pad for challenging for European places in the Premier League. I think is the lesson we can take.
Yeah.
That's a twisted logic I can apply to that.
That's the way we sell this podcast.
That's the way we do it. Yeah, you're going to learn something that may not even be statistically or factually true. You want to talk about the Champions League final now?
Well, actually, should we get into what we think is going to happen and who? I actually, given that you're more on the tactical side,
thank you very much.
The rest of it. How much do you think that Man United's culture of winning and Spurs' culture of not winning influences a fixture like this?
Oh, what a question! I would say less than fuck all. I would say goes into this. If you believe in these concepts, and I know Postecoglou himself is always at pains to address, we've got to fix the culture here. I think he said if we won it, it would raise sort of 50% of every criticism this club gets. Obviously, Amorim also references, this is a club with a history of winning things. I think if you believe that has a real tangible impact on the field, whether it's something that actually gets into players' minds, if it doesn't work the other way, it makes the other team more hungry or the other team more complacent. If you believe this is a real thing, I will promise you now, this game will be so low on quality. You will be able, people can't get a ticket for this game. They can't get flights out there. It doesn't matter. If you are in continental Europe, you will be able to smell the desperation when this game kicks off. Never mind have to watch it. This will be such an attritional, full of mistakes, panicked game of football because it is all or nothing for both of these sides. You're going to be the worst team ever to go into the Champions League anyway, but at least you'll go into the Champions League. Yeah. Otherwise, you are simply the worst team in the Premier League era this club has ever had. You will never wash that stink off you. Yeah. It will be two terrified 11s, both paralysed by the idea of making a mistake.
But this is where I do think there is some element to it, because we obviously we're talking about psychology now.
Yeah.
And I do think that in moments like this, and I suppose I saw the most visible example of this when I was, say, at Madrid and the Bernabeu when they knocked out Man City or Paris Saint-Germain.
Yeah.
And I think there is an element of that. If you're at a club where you're surrounded by all these images of history, like that can be, even if it's subconscious, I think it can help fortify.
You're talking about both these clubs here.
Well, we're Man United, I suppose. and with Spurs, like, especially if a moment, say with Spurs, a moment goes wrong, you could forgive players, think like just even sensing a certain fatalism, and I think that's where it can have an effect. But I do agree, like when it comes right down to it, look, the DNA of clubs has changed over years. If you get the right people in,
I will promise you this: at some point during this game, there will be a camera cut to both managers separately on the touchline, rubbing their temples vigorously. That will be all over social media. They are both going to have the worst nights of their life.
Politburo. It'll be Man United's Politburo, and on the other side, Daniel Levy.
Just looking so unimpressed.
Yeah.
And yet somehow, and I can't believe I'm saying this, somehow one of those teams is going to win that match and be in the Champions League next season.
On that, so I suppose for the purposes of people slagging us off in future, maybe, should we give predictions for both finals?
Well, to quote Bobby Robson, I don't make predictions and I never will.
Really?
That was a famous Bobby Robson quote.
Well, I mean, do you subscribe to that?
Yes.
Okay.
Even though it's a famous contradiction of it. That's why I like it. I don't make predictions and I predict I never will.
Okay.
I think that game finishes 3-1 to the worst team. I think the team that literally you were watching that and you will not believe that team's won it.
I'm going to go 3-2 Manchester United.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much what I was. Who do you want? I know we shouldn't say this because then someone will clip it and it'll come back in 5 years when we're talking about something else. Who do you want to win? Just look deep into your soul and pull out what you think would be better.
I think I actually have two conflicting opinions about this, especially because of like what the clubs are. Like, anytime there's a final like this where one team wins a lot, regardless of the situation, and one team doesn't, it's hard. It's hard to think it's. Again, I've talked about vitality and variety of football. It's hard to think it would be like Spurs would have value it more, I have to say.
Oh, God,
I'm not
by
saying
a million miles.
Exactly. So, but then equally on the other side, I know this isn't necessarily a popular opinion, but I do think a strong. Well, I actually think it's a bit of a football tragedy that a great institution like Manchester United has been allowed to become what it is, and that is largely due to the ownerships. And obviously, they need this to kind of try and get back. So from that perspective, I can see it. But at the same time, I do think it's so. There is something wrong with the football of structure. So with structure football, if United and Spurs have wasted so much money over years, so much Premier League money, regardless of anything else, and like they need a game like this to get them back into it.
The equivalent of Manchester United winning this, and this has simply just popped into my head while you've been talking, it's like someone who was really horrible to you your entire childhood.
Well, you're a Newcastle fan.
Losing all their money in crypto, and just as you're about to be like, yeah, you know what, that serves you right, they just find a winning lottery ticket on the floor, right in front of you.
And a classic example was last season with the Cup. I mean, like speaking to like City fans, and like some of them they still talk about like this. Regardless of all the success they have, there's still this thing with Manchester United, and they finally get it over Manchester United. Obviously, like they just destroyed them a lot of the time, and yet then when it comes down to a game like the Cup final
got beat. But Manchester United were brilliant in that cup final. I wanted Man United to win that. It's all circumstantial. People love to just say, "Oh, you don't like this club, you don't like it." I really wanted Man United to win that FA Cup final. I was delighted when they did. But for the same reason, I want Tottenham to win that game. As a fan of a club who finally got their moment, right? And people were sniffy about it. People were like, "Oh, it's just this. Don't worry about it." And people will be the same with this. It's like meant to be a Champions League side. You know, you had this big stadium, and you're celebrating like this for winning the Europa League. The celebration will be out, but that's not going to make one blind bit of difference to the fans who go over there or the fans who are still back over here watching it. I think that would be really nice for Tottenham, and it is the most funny of the two options. Also, this is a whole other issue. I don't think either of those sides could cope with Champions League football next summer, given their squad. I mean, look at the injuries they had without. I mean, they've been in the Europa League, obviously the early stages. There wasn't even that big of a fixture issue for them. Both of those, you would imagine that whichever side gets into the Champions League this season, yes, it's better for them. They're probably able to do better in the transfer market. PSR situation's obviously a lot easier. But someone can clip this and send it back to me. I will bet you, whichever team wins this final is lower in the league by Christmas than the team that loses it.
Yeah. That's pretty,
That was
Marco Silva Spurs against.
That's my prediction. That's my prediction. It's short-lived joy for long-term pain.
Yeah,
Which would you rather have? Short-term joy every single time.
I think for United, this is just so. Like, from what I've been told right now, they've got like these parallel plans for the summer transfer window. They want a striker, obviously, but then if they qualify for the Champions League, you are talking about Amram potentially being able to change half this team in a way he couldn't do if they don't win it.
Feels like this is a real sliding doors moment for English football. Isn't it?
It does feel like that. Yeah.
That's probably the best preview anyone's going to do. Let's talk about the Champions League now.
Just as you're talking about it, I'm going to put it in my preview, my written preview.
Great, there you go. And when you read that, you can be like, I know where that came from. Right, Champions League final. Way less funny, way less drama. It's not a comedy final. It's not a desperation final. It's just arguably two of the best teams in Europe. Certainly the two teams that have come into some of the best form in the Champions League, contesting an old-fashioned, no English team involved European Cup final.
An old-fashioned and also, I suppose, a very modern final in that. Like, we just can't go without saying, given the book behind me there. I suppose, like, Qatar's PSG. Qatar could actually get what they want most after the World Cup, which is finally the club they own in the Champions League. That does bring a different dimension to it. And it's funny the way throughout this season, from a pure football perspective, or not even from a pure football perspective, Paris Saint-Germain have been painted as, people talk about a breath of fresh air, a young team. And that is true in terms of the profile of the team. And I do think, like, Luis Enrique is obviously, I think he's, from what I know of him, a great coach and I think a good man. And obviously there's the personal story there with his daughter and the way he's spoken about that. And I think, people want him to win. I absolutely get that. But it's saying people talk about, like, the youth of this team. Paris Saint-Germain they still spend about 100 million bringing in Barcola and Doué.
Yep.
And then they go out and buy one of the best players in the world in Kvaratskhelia, a deal that was really difficult to do. A lot of other clubs wanted it, but they found it really difficult to A, negotiate with Napoli, and B, to negotiate with Kvaratskelia's representatives. Then, also, I think a lot of other people in football would say that PSG, basically, they got to almost kind of the extreme of this star era with Messi and Neymar, where they're basically kind of almost drummed out of the club by fans. Then, suddenly we're in a situation where, despite what they could pay, a lot of stars were looking to go to them, so they have to kind of pivot to young players. And obviously, I think I've already mentioned this stat on the show before, but I do love it. Paris is one of the 3 most fertile places footballers in the world. So they're sitting on this groundswell of talent.
With one club as well.
Yeah. They pivot, and so
City the size of London.
Yeah,
and it's got one sort of.
Exactly.
I mean, obviously Paris FC are doing well, so Red Star are there, but certainly at this level, there's only PSG. They can the talent they can hoover up is unbelievable.
Absolutely. And yet they've had to pivot to this, and now they're presenting this master plan they always want. Whereas people in football say they just had no choice, and they've had to, and suddenly it's worked out for them. But yet.
Come on. Have you ever had any success in anything? Nobody's ever planned anything. That's just what you do.
Yeah.
You think I wanted to be on YouTube? You just stumble into it and make it look like that's what you wanted to do all along.
Yeah.
Inter obviously the exact polar opposite team. But I mean, look at who was the lad who scored the winner in the semi-finals? He was 47 years old or something ridiculous. He's older than me.
It was Serbia, the equaliser.
Yeah. He's older than me. It's the complete opposite sort of way of putting a team together, where it's just total buy into a more simple system.
And it's funny with Inter as well, and even the kind of echoes of how they knocked out Barcelona in the same way. Well, not in the same way as they did in 2010. Completely different to what they did in 2010. But I suppose it's more like it's the character of the team. I was speaking to someone who represents a few players at PSG, and the word they use, this team is full of warriors.
Yeah.
You can question anything about them, and it's funny if you want to get into the kind of other dimension. In some ways, Inter are actually a consequence of what happens when a state loses interest in football, because previously there had been a lot of Chinese investments.
Yeah.
China has obviously pulled back from football. The ownership structures are different than, say, the way Qatar is, but it still evolved out of the ownership still evolved out of the Chinese football project. Inter have been fighting debts. They're one of the Super League teams.
Stadium situations still
the stadium.
all over the place,
which I actually, just as a brief tangent, it always slightly Inter are basically desperate to move away from the San Siro, and it does fill me with sadness. That I've been to the San Siro now a few times, and there is nothing in football, especially for someone whose first World Cup really was 1990. As you walk up and you see those red girders, it's one of those where there's nothing like it.
I've done 3 separate videos on the future of the San Siro for here and for other channels, and it's just it would be. I hate this move away. I understand a lot of the motivation behind it, but I hate the move away from these traditional old stadiums to these just revenue generating live experience locations, which is all they're becoming.
Essentially NFL stadiums.
Yeah, and I hate it. I think it's a complete myth as well that clubs need to do this to compete. Blah blah blah. But of all the crimes you could commit, of all the stadiums you could knock down that are currently being talked about being knocked down, I think the San Siro is at the very, very top of that. Yeah. And I get it. I've known people who've been. They say it's a hellhole. It's a nightmare to get to. There's nothing around the ground. But
people are right about some of the facilities, even the press facilities. So I wasn't at the Inter Barca game because I was in Paris for the Arsenal, the press conference and all that.
I wasn't at the Arsenal. I wasn't at that game by the way because I was at the theatre. That's just that's the lives we live.
But colleagues who were there, they were sending photos. So obviously, this is a game between a Spanish club and an Italian club. So the English media, despite our notions, we don't get preferential treatment. So some colleagues were there basically in these observer seats with no desk, no power, on their laptops, so they had fans in front of them. And so as they're trying to write, they have fans because ultimately it doesn't have those modern facilities.
When you say fans here, do you mean something circulating in the air or somebody with a flare?
Not quite someone with a flare, but
right, okay,
someone is jumping up and singing.
Great.
And yet, still, obviously, they thought it was a privilege for them to be there. And with the same token, it does feel an old stadium now when you're in it. But I remember I was there for the semi-finals 2 years ago in the Milan derbies.
Yeah.
And I remember, this is actually, I might get a bit of heat for this. This is more true, I found, for AC Milan than Inter. When Milan were the home team, when they play the Champions League music and at the end they all start kind of like they all the whole entire ground plays like the champions. You could feel the stadium shake.
That's cute.
You could feel the concrete. Like it was incredible. I have to say.
Not the Inter fans.
Inter fans, they were still amazing for their game, but for me, it's the Milan game the Milan home game that stands.
I don't know what our viewership is in Italy at the minute. I think you could have said anything. You probably get away with that at this stage. We are getting pushed for time at this point. I am going to have to ask you for a prediction, even though we don't make predictions. Inter PSG. What's the Tottenham Man United equivalent is? Who needs it, and who needs it for like the culture, and who needs it for the very future of their club?
Well, Inter need it for the future more because PSG are owned by Qatar. They've been going at this for years, and that's probably why. So on an institutional level and an ownership level, PSG are desperate for it. Especially after all the failures they've experienced. I just don't think that is necessarily a very good thing for football. It's a state club that wins it. There's all sorts of, all sorts of greater discussions you could have about there. That said, I mean the fans been following. I mean, PSG were actually originally a fan created.
Yeah, the history of them is absolutely amazing.
And like, it's funny when you go to a PSG game as well. There is almost this kind of like this dichotomy. On one side, you've got like the ownership and what it is an event. So like some of it actually feels like a fashion show. The music they play, some of like the level of celebrity that goes to Paris Saint-Germain game, and that's almost counteracted then by the incredible noise the ultras make on both sides, and obviously they crave it. But I do think. It's more. It would mean more for Inter's future, but they have won it more recently in 2010. Or they've won it. PSG never have. But one thing I would say, actually, in terms of a prediction, this is a discussion that obviously came up after the semi-final and discuss how Inter Barca was, I would say at this point, probably the best European tie ever. But there is
again, was at the theatre that night.
Yeah. Well, you missed the great.
Yeah. I got out and I checked my phone and I was like, yeah, good.
But
Dear England's great, by the way. In case anyone's wondering, it's just not as good as.
I say good. I'm not sure it goes out great. Anyway, that's a separate.
That's for the Culture Channel.
Yeah. But I think there are specific reasons why Champions League semi-finals, like if you consider like the contenders for the best European tie ever, loads of them are semi-finals. Whereas I don't think we've had a good final. Actually, 2015 was a good final.
I hate to be the person who says this because it feels dead insensitive, but the Loris Karius final is very good because that's a television event unlike you ever watched before.
I think that's got moments of drama. It's a bit like the Italian 90s World Cup. It's got moments of drama and storyline. It's not necessarily high quality entertainment, if you know what I mean.
I was entertained to a high quality. I think a lot of people were entertained to a high quality.
I never really thought Liverpool were in the game. It's not like 2005, which I would say is the last truly great final as an epic. I think, in a purely football sense, this has the ingredients to be an epic because there are some parallels with the way
it's a bit like World Cup finals. I mean, obviously the most recent World Cup final was fantastic, but there's elements of just sort of like when you get to a level where every single player, regardless of their inbuilt disinterest in their own lives, gets a chance to win something as big as that.
Yeah.
Their nerves creep in, and again, the refusal to want to make a mistake.
Yeah.
But I would argue, I think that France team that's just footballing style basically gave us how good that final was because they were really open and really attacking.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of that France team in this PSG team in the way they play, and I think we could, as a result, get probably one of the most open finals we've seen for a very long time.
And even the way PSG don't play the high line that Barca do. No one does really. I mean, about Spurs in England, but they do have a style which meshes nicely with Inter style in terms of potentially creating a similar.
Stars make fights.
Yeah. So I think it's going to be open. I do.
Go on, who's winning? Yeah, I'm going to do the score.
I think most logic suggests Paris Saint-Germain will win, but there's just something about the way Inter got through that Barca game that.
Well, it was exactly the same situation as the Barca game. You fancy, even after the first leg, you were like, they'll still do them. That'll be absolutely fine. And they just ground it out. They found a way. They managed to stop them playing. They played well themselves.
Yeah.
I do think PSG run through them like a steam train on a small dog. But
Well, I tell you, one of the things when you watch PSG now, and I really sense this in the Arsenal game, what's so distinctive, and I think what makes them unique in world football right now, bar Yamal, is it's not just they can press you so intensely and attack you at speed. It's also the speed of their footwork. They've got so many dribblers.
God.
They're actually quite given like all this debate about kind of the Guardiola paradigm and all this and control. To have so many players that are dribblers that just
They're
take
so
you on.
I find them so refreshing to watch. It's like watching a load of year 11s play football.
Yeah.
Like I think they're really, really good to watch. But who's going to win? Come on, right. Who's going to win?
I'm going to go against myself and say Inter. I might change that in my written preview.
So just to get this, so I'm saying PSG. Like again, like a dog getting hit by a car. I think the game's going to end up being like. But you're saying Inter.
51-49 Inter, but I might change that.
Who are you saying for the Europa League?
Man United.
Man United. So we're both. So I've got Inter and I've got PSG and Tottenham.
Yeah.
Which potentially we could both be wrong across all those options. Right. What I'd like to hear, though, is who you think's going to win both of those games. Because it doesn't matter, but it's just fun that somebody gets to say they were right at the end of all this. So please do let us know. Is there a comment section? I presume there is. Stick it down there.
YouTube.
Yeah, stick it down there if there is. And Miguel, where can they get you on social media if they want to do that?
My name all is one on all platforms. Miguel Delaney, just.
Yeah, that's really on
my Blue Sky, Insta.
Same for me, at Adam Clery, CLEOI. The Independent's got loads of different things. We'll probably stick some of them on the screen. You can follow those as well. But until next time, which will be after all these finals, so we'll get to find out if we have any idea what we're talking about at all. Thank you for joining us. This has been State of Play, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Miguel.